So, do the police need more funding, and can the country afford it? Joining me now from our Westminster studios are Stephen Roberts, former Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, and Alex Wild. He's Research Director at the Taxpayers Alliance. Stephen Roberts, can we start with you? What did you make of what you heard there in Mark White's report?
I think we need to be careful about being alarmist. The situation is far more serious than I've known it in my 40 years service. But the police service, both in London and nationally, has enormous strength in depth. The problem is not coping with the current crises, and they are crises, not simply a single crisis, but in how we position the service nationally for the next few years.
Alex Wild, we've had obviously Manchester, London Bridge, Grenfell Tower, all of these huge, very high-profile demands that we see the pressure being put on police officers. In terms of cuts, is a consensus naturally forming that they shouldn't be happening given what we're seeing?
Well, I think we have to take this seriously, because on a lot of these programmes you hear about people coming on talking about cuts in welfare and cuts to the NHS, which haven't actually happened. The police is different in that the budget has been fairly significantly decreased in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and it's an inevitable consequence of government policy when so much of spending is on NHS, welfare, debt interest. Obviously that can't be negotiated, so the axe, sort of, so to speak, has to fall disproportionately on smaller things like the police. But I also think it's important to look at efficiency in the police. I think there are probably too many forces. I think there's space for some consolidation there, and there was a report from HMIC last year showing that only 2 police forces in the country were sort of running at outstanding levels of efficiency. But there are a lot of things the government can do that are not budget related. I mean, if you look at severity of sentencing for assaulting a police officer, it's decreased very significantly since 2011, and these are things that massively increase stress levels. I mean, it's far, spitting at a police officer is far more tolerated now than it was in the past. There are things that there are things that the government can do beyond it's just spending more money.
Stephen, I think you may be referring there to Alex saying there is a lack of efficiency in certain areas.
He's quite right. There are efficiency savings that can be made, but 80% of the cost of policing is the cost of police officers' salaries and the salaries of support staff. The combining police forces, for example, it doesn't, unless you end up with the same number of people, the overall efficiency is going to be very similar. So we have to be honest about this and say, if we want the numbers of properly trained, properly equipped and properly rested police officers to be able to deal properly with the sorts of crises that they're facing now, I'm afraid they have to be paid for, and I'm afraid there's only one place it can come from, which is tax.
I think properly rested is an interesting point there, isn't it, Alex? Certainly from what we heard in Mark White's report. It's being able to recover from what are very intensive operations that officers are working on, and can that only be done with more people, therefore more money?
Sure, it's under pressure, but there's an opportunity cost to everything. Money that's spent on the police is money that isn't spent on the NHS. We have to, the government has to make these kind of decisions. And I do think that there are questions really about what do we actually want from the police, because we have actually seen very significant expense on basically political witch hunts against certain journalists and some of the historic sex crimes stuff. Is that really the real priority at the moment, or do we need to be focusing more resources on things like terrorism, which is obviously going to be a massive challenge for the foreseeable future? So there are opportunity costs here.
Stephen, what do we want from the police now? What is the role in our society as we stand when there are so many different challenges that they now face? What is the police role?
I think the police role is to make the communities feel safe and secure, and for them to be safe and secure. The real challenge for chief police officers isn't deciding what to do, it's deciding what not to do, what gets the lower priority. If we concentrate on counter-terrorism, then is that at the expense of armed robbery, organised crime, the protection of children? These are all really difficult choices that have to be made. I don't think the public want officers, experienced detectives, removed from child protection, for example, in order to work on counter-terrorism. I think the public want to have confidence that the uniformed officers that they see patrolling are actually members of and belong to the communities that they patrol. If there isn't that fundamental trust in the policing structure. Oh yeah, priorities have to be made, and governments have to make priorities, have to set priorities too. Ultimately, how much money is put into policing is a political decision. But the way things are going at the moment, more and more officers will become exhausted. You will find there are more errors of judgment, mistakes operationally, and the public pay the cost for that.
Alex, and just in terms of how much we spend on policing, how does it compare with other countries?
Well, it's quite difficult to compare because there's an apples and pears situation. I mean, the police have a different role in this country than they do in other countries. But generally speaking, and sort of the best comparisons we get is we're towards the sort of upper third of countries, developed countries, as a proportion of the economy. So I'm not, the police do have different roles, so you've got to be very careful making comparisons like that. But best guesstimate is that we do spend quite a lot, compared to other countries, generally speaking. But as I said, it's a difficult comparison to make because police forces do have different roles in different countries.
And just finally, Stephen, do you think, given how far and how much pressure we've seen at the moment, are things at breaking point? You said at the beginning not to sort of overplay this, but how do you see the current situation?
The current situation is grim, and it's being met by a grim determination from serving officers that I still speak to deal with it. The real issue is, how do we get on through the next 2, 3, 4 years? If we're going to increase police numbers, we need to start recruiting them now in order to have competent, experienced police officers on the streets in 18 months, 2 years' time. So it's not about the immediate problems. It's really about how do we go on from here, locally and nationally.
Stephen Roberts, Alex Wilde, thank you both very much for your time.